Okay, so I read this and I think it is interesting and useful to share it. Um, so, dear writer, advice on tackling difficult stories. Dear writer, on taking the glass bottom boat approach in first person writing to interpret painful stories for your readers. We asked Lauren Wolfe for her advice in tackling heavy subject matter while keeping her audience engaged. Lauren is an award-winning journalist and photographer of more than 20 years. She spent more than a decade reporting from war zones in which women and girls are violated. Before that, 5 years documenting violence and the suppression of journalists globally. She has written for The Atlantic and Guardian and is a contributing writer for The Washington Monthly and an adjunct professor at NYU's Graduate School of Journalism. Lauren writes from the front line of conflict in her newsletter, Chills, and gives a behind the scenes look at how dangerous investigative journalism gets made. Read on for her response. Dear writer, how do I use Substack to cover heavier topics? Well, by the time I came to Substack at the start of 2021, I'd been covering, as one editor put it, the stories that make people cry for nearly 20 years. I'd reported from places like an impoverished village in the Democratic Republic of Congo and sun-baked Syrian refugee camps. I'd spent a few years in the 2000s at the New York Times reporting on the deeply personal horrors of 9/11. While stories of trauma fascinated me and deserved telling, I was never sure how many people wanted to read them. It seemed like I'd developed a core readership, but it was limited. Then, my second stint at the Times ended last year in my very public firing, and I became infamous. It was brutal. People sent death threats and abuse my way every day for months, but something pretty great came out of the nightmare too. I started hearing from new readers of my work, thanking me for writing about the really hard stuff to cover. Still, they had questions. Why hadn't they heard about this or that atrocity before? Honestly, I didn't know. I'd written big stories involving war crimes and violations of international human rights in The Guardian, The Atlantic, and so on. I'd wondered whether to blame the outlets because they didn't position my stories high enough, or the readers because they'd avoided clicking the hard to digest stories. Eventually, I landed on a third answer. While I don't let the outlets and readers entirely off the hook, I realized that I deserved a good portion of the blame too. You can't just sling pain at people nonstop and expect them to stomach it over and over. And in a time of deep mistrust of journalism, you can't expect readers to understand why this kind of work is critical and how it is constructed differently from political and other kinds of reporting. How can anyone understand the difficult ethical choices involved in such work or why they should care if we as journalists don't bother to make that kind of explication part of what we do? That's how I found my mission on Substack. I realized that the platform was a gift to me as a writer and to readers if I used it to start offering more than this unusually or usually possible in traditional media. For the kind of journalism I do, that meant that I suddenly had the space to go beyond the scenes, behind the scenes, to show readers that even if they can't relate to the people I write about at first, they can relate to me as the storyteller, and